It was a war the world has almost forgotten. But one photograph, a single frame, captured something so dangerous, so unexpected. The military tried to erase it from history forever. In it, a lone woman, barely clothed, walks calmly between two walls of armed soldiers. No one knows why she was there or what happened next. Some say she was a spy, others that she was a warning. But the truth is far more shocking and far more dangerous than anyone has ever dared to tell. Welcome to Historia Unseen. I'm John, the voiceover artist for this channel, and today you'll hear the story behind a photograph they never wanted you to see. The morning sun never broke through the smoke that day. The city, once full of market cries and the sound of street musicians, was now nothing but the clinking of metal and the stomping of boots. It was the birth of a nation, or so they told the people. A new government, a new order, a fresh start, promised by men in pressed uniforms and polished helmets. But behind the speeches, behind the carefully staged parades, were the sounds they didn't want you to hear. The crying behind closed doors, the sharp knock on a neighbor's door at midnight, the last footsteps of those who never came back. The soldiers lined the main street like statues, their rifles ready, their eyes cold, their breath visible in the morning air. And then, from the far end of that ruined street, she appeared, tall, slim, her black bikini a shocking contrast to the dust and rubble around her. Her hair tied loosely, swaying with every step. Black boots laced tight, the kind soldiers wear. Every man in uniform turned his head. Not one moved. She walked slowly, deliberately, as if each step had been rehearsed 1,000 times. There was no fear in her face, only something deeper, something unreadable. To the soldiers, she was an intruder. To the few civilians watching from shuttered windows, she was a question no one dared to answer. The truth was, this moment had been planned. For weeks before that day, the city had been boiling. Small groups had been meeting in back rooms and abandoned factories. They whispered of resistance. They shared stolen radios to hear foreign broadcasts. They drew maps marking safe houses and escape routes. And she was part of it. Her mission was simple, but deadly. Draw every soldier's attention. Make them look at her. Keep them looking long enough for what was about to happen behind the barricades. Somewhere, just out of sight, another group was moving, carrying papers, smuggling weapons, guiding prisoners out through a hidden alley. Every second she walked, every heartbeat between her steps, was a second stolen from a soldier's watch. The street was long, and the silence felt heavier with each step. Boots scuffed on the cracked pavement. A helmet lay in the dust, kicked aside earlier in the chaos. Someone shouted an order, but no one broke formation. She passed the first line of soldiers, then the second, then the third. Each row was closer to the center of power, the government building at the end of the street. Inside that building, leaders were celebrating the birth of their nation, never realizing that outside, in the middle of their own soldiers, a quiet act of defiance was unfolding. The camera that took the photo was hidden, tucked in the hands of a man pretending to be part of the press. One click, one flash of the shutter, and the image was captured forever. But the photographer knew what would come next. If the military saw the photo, it wouldn't just be confiscated. It would be destroyed, along with anyone connected to it. Still, he took it, because he understood something the soldiers didn't. This was more than a strange scene. This was proof. Proof that in the middle of fear, there were still those willing to walk straight into the heart of danger. She reached the last row of soldiers, her eyes fixed forward, her pace unchanged. Some said she was walking to meet someone inside. Others believed she never made it past those gates. The city had been loud once. Vendors shouting prices at the market. Children chasing each other through narrow streets. Musicians playing in open squares until the stars came out. But on this day, the air carried nothing but the heavy hum of military trucks and the low clatter of rifles being checked and loaded. Every window was shut. Every door was locked. Curtains moved only when someone dared to peek outside. The soldiers had taken every corner, every intersection, every rooftop with a view of the main road. It was not a celebration. It was a warning. The birth of the new nation had arrived, but it came wrapped in fear. And in the middle of this silence, People whispered about her. The woman from the photograph. The one who walked half-dressed between walls of soldiers, as if the rifles and helmets were nothing but shadows on her path. Some said she was not from the city at all, that she had come from the mountains, where rebel fighters still held out. Others swore she was the daughter of a man executed by the old regime, someone who wanted revenge in her own way. But the truth was more complicated. She had been here for days, hiding in an abandoned apartment just 3 streets away from the main square. Her contact, a thin man with restless eyes, brought her small bags of food and pieces of paper covered in scribbled notes. They had planned the walk for weeks. They knew when the soldiers changed positions, when the officers switched shifts, when the street would be lined but distracted. The risk was beyond reason. One wrong move, one soldier stepping forward, and it would all be over. But she had something no soldier there understood. A confidence that came from knowing every step was part of a bigger plan. Far away, at the other end of the city, a group was waiting. In hidden rooms, in the back of shops, in the shadows of warehouses, men and women prepared to move. They were carrying documents, names, addresses, safe routes. They were moving people the military wanted to keep locked away forever. Her walk was their signal. When she reached the 3rd row of soldiers, they would begin. Every soldier's eye would be on her, and not on the alleys where the real operation was taking place. The photographer had been told only enough to do his job. Capture the moment. Get the film out. Stay alive. He had hidden himself near a wall of broken bricks, crouched low, the lens wrapped in cloth to keep it from shining. His heart raced as he saw her appear at the far end of the street, because in that instant he understood. If she fell, the plan fell with her. Her first steps were slow, deliberate. The soldiers did not raise their rifles. Some smiled faintly, others stared without expression. The boots on her feet crunched against broken glass. A loose helmet rolled from the gutter, clinking softly before coming to rest against a soldier's leg. The man with the camera adjusted the focus. In that narrow frame, he saw the contrast. Black fabric against pale skin, feminine curves against hard metal and thick uniforms, fearless movement against rigid formation. The crowd behind the windows barely breathed. They knew, whatever this was, it would not happen twice. And as she reached the 1st row of soldiers, the photographer pressed the shutter. The click was soft, but the moment was loud enough to echo for decades. What no one knew was that someone else had also seen her. Not a soldier, not a civilian, a man in plain clothes standing in the shadow of a doorway, watching her every step, and already making a decision that would change the rest of her life. But that would only be revealed much later. The photograph spread quietly, not in newspapers, not on radio, but through whispers. It moved from hand to hand in back rooms. It was hidden in envelopes and passed under tables. Sometimes it was shown in secret to a trusted friend, who would only shake their head and ask, "Who is she?" No one had an answer. The soldiers didn't know her name. The officers claimed she didn't exist, and the government said nothing at all. But the people talked, and the more they talked, the more the story changed. In one version, she was a spy from a foreign land, sent to test the soldiers' discipline. In another, she was a symbol, a silent warning that the revolution had not died. A few swore she had been in the city before, wearing plain clothes, moving through markets like any other woman, only to vanish for weeks at a time. The truth was more dangerous than all the rumors combined. Her name was never written down, not on paper, not on any list. Even the man who brought her food and messages didn't know it. He called her Luz, Light, not because it was her real name, but because she was meant to draw attention, to pull eyes and minds in her direction. While others worked in the dark, the man in plain clothes, the one who had been watching her from the doorway, had followed her for 3 days before the walk. He wasn't military. He wasn't a rebel. He worked in a place between both worlds, a man with connections in the government, but debts to the people. When he saw her that morning, he knew she was not walking for herself. He knew she was the bait. Behind her, far from the main road, a small group moved quickly. They carried something far more dangerous than guns. Papers, lists, names of prisoners, names of those marked for arrest. If these names stayed in government hands, families would vanish overnight. If they reached the rebels, it could change the war. Luz, if that was her name, had agreed to walk in the open. It was the one move no one expected. A half-naked woman in the middle of a coup. The soldiers wouldn't shoot, but they wouldn't ignore her either. Every step she took, every second they stared, was a second the group needed. The man in plain clothes decided to follow her, not openly, but at a distance, watching from shadow to shadow, wondering if she would make it all the way. The photographer, hidden behind his wall of bricks, didn't know any of this. All he saw was the contrast between beauty and war, between skin and steel, between calm and chaos. He took the shot. He lowered the camera, and in that instant, he saw something in her eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defiance. It was something colder, something that said, "I know exactly how this ends." What neither the photographer nor the man in plain clothes knew was that before the sun set, Luz would vanish. She would leave no trail, no witnesses, no proof she had ever been there at all, except for one photograph, and a secret so dangerous, it would take 30 years before anyone dared to speak it aloud. Hours before the walk, the city was already tense. The soldiers had been ordered to lock down the main road. Trucks blocked both ends. Checkpoints stood every few blocks. Somewhere in an old apartment with broken shutters, she sat on a wooden chair, staring at the floor. A man, thin, nervous, smelling of tobacco, slid an envelope across the table. Inside were two things: a folded paper and a small metal key. "Don't stop," he told her. "No matter what happens, don't stop." She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The less she knew, the safer she was, or so they told her. But she understood the stakes. The folded paper carried names. The key opened a door in a government building that wasn't supposed to exist. The plan was simple on paper, but deadly in reality. While she walked between the soldiers, every camera, every pair of eyes, every twitch of attention would follow her. The soldiers would forget to check the alleys. They wouldn't notice a foreign journalist slipping into the side entrance of the government building. The journalist's job was to take something from inside, a box of files containing prisoner lists and photographs of people the military had removed from the city. If the list stayed hidden, families would disappear without a trace. If they were exposed, the new government would face shame before the world. The walk was the distraction. The exchange would happen in the shadows. The photographer had been placed carefully, just far enough to capture her and the soldiers in one frame, close enough to make the photo unforgettable. The man in plain clothes, the one watching her from the shadows, began to move too. Not toward her, but toward the building. He had his own orders, ones that didn't match either side. And so, 3 separate games began at once. She walked. The journalist slipped through the side gate. The man in plain clothes vanished into a back alley. Every step she took made the soldiers turn their heads. They shifted their rifles. They followed her with their eyes. And without knowing it, they turned their backs to the real danger. Inside the building, the journalist found the door the key opened. Stacks of folders sat on a desk, some marked with red stamps, some marked with black. The red ones were arrests. The black ones were deaths. He stuffed as many as he could into his bag, knowing every second counted. On the street, she passed the second row of soldiers. The silence was heavy now. Not a sound except the faint click of the photographer's camera. A young soldier's eyes followed her, not with lust, but with suspicion. His grip on the rifle tightened. His lips parted as if to speak, and then a loud crash echoed from the alley behind him. The soldier turned his head, and in that tiny moment, the last file was placed in the journalist's bag. She walked on, unaware of the noise, the files, or the man in plain clothes who had just caused it. To her, the mission was simple: walk and never stop. But in truth, the mission had already split into pieces, and not all of them would serve the same side. By the time she reached the third row of soldiers, the files were gone from the building, and so was the man in plain clothes. Somewhere in the middle of the crowd, the real danger was no longer the rifles or the uniforms. It was the fact that more than one person now held the same deadly secret. The walk lasted less than 3 minutes, but its shadow stretched for decades. By sunset, the streets were cleared. The soldiers returned to their barracks. The trucks rolled away, and she was gone. No one saw her leave. No one saw where she went. She simply vanished. The photographer didn't wait to find out what happened next. He pulled the film from his camera, slipped it into a cloth pouch, and hid it deep in his jacket. He knew what would happen if the military found it. The photo would be destroyed, and he would be erased along with it. But word of the image had already begun to spread. Someone had seen him take it, and in the world of 1970s politics, that was enough to make him a target. That night, 2 plainclothed men appeared at his door. They didn't knock. They simply walked in. The photographer was gone. He had slipped out hours earlier, but the men searched his apartment anyway. Drawers were pulled open. Floorboards were pried loose. Every frame on the wall was smashed. They found nothing, because the film wasn't in the city anymore. While soldiers guarded the streets, the photographer had handed the pouch to a friend, a street vendor who sold newspapers and cigarettes. That vendor took a bus to the edge of the city and crossed into a border town where military patrols were weak. The plan was to deliver the film to a foreign reporter staying at a small hotel, but the hotel was already being watched. 2 days later, the vendor was found in an alley. No money, no papers, no film. The military now had it. And just like that, the only known copy of the photograph was gone. Or so they believed. What they didn't know was that the photographer had made a single duplicate hours before giving the original away. He had hidden it somewhere no soldier would ever think to look. But someone else already knew where it was. The man in plain clothes. The same man who had caused the distraction in the alley. The same man who had disappeared before the end of the walk was now hunting the duplicate. And his reasons had nothing to do with protecting the woman. 30 years passed. The city had changed. The soldiers were gone from the streets. New leaders stood where the old ones had fallen. But the shadows were still there. In a dusty antique shop in Lisbon, a collector flipped through a box of war memorabilia, medals, faded letters, rusted badges. At the bottom was a sealed envelope marked only with a date. Inside, a photograph. Grainy, black and white. A woman in a bikini, walking between 2 walls of armed soldiers. The collector didn't know the story, but he knew the image was rare. It had a weight to it, like it had been carried across borders and hidden in the dark for years. He bought it, and without meaning to, he brought it back into the world. Soon, whispers began again. Historians wanted to know the truth. Journalists wanted to print it. Former soldiers wanted to bury it all over again. One man recognized it immediately, older now, his hair gray, his face lined with age. The photographer. He had lived in exile for decades, but the sight of the image pulled him back into the past. He still remembered the sound of the shutter, the way her eyes never looked away from the road ahead, and he still remembered the man in plain clothes, the one who had been watching her that day. That man was still alive, and he had a very different story to tell. The 2 men met in a quiet cafe outside the city. For hours, they spoke in low voices. The man in plain clothes revealed what no one had known. The walk had not just been a distraction, it had been a test. Someone high in the government had wanted to see how far the soldiers' loyalty could be bent. If they could be distracted by beauty, they could be manipulated by anything. And the woman? She had agreed, but for her own reasons. Her walk had covered something else entirely. A second operation that neither man had been told about. One that had nothing to do with prisoner lists, and everything to do with the survival of a single, unknown name. A name that had never been on any list. By the time the cafe meeting ended, the photograph had vanished again. Not stolen, not lost, hidden, because now both men understood the same thing. The photo was no longer just evidence. It was a key, and whoever held it could finally unlock the truth of what happened on that silent day. The photograph lay on the table between them, grainy, silent, unchanging, but now they both knew what it meant. The woman in the picture, Luz, as she had been called, had never been part of one mission. She had been part of 2. The first was the one everyone suspected, the distraction, the walk. the turning of every soldier's head while files slipped out of the government building. But the second had never been spoken aloud. Hidden beneath the chaos of that day was a single man locked inside a small holding room in the same government building. He wasn't a rebel. He wasn't a soldier. He was a courier, the only person who knew the location of a secret weapons cache meant to arm the resistance. If he vanished, the rebellion would die. If he survived, it could still win. Her walk was timed to the minute. While soldiers' eyes were on her, two people slipped into the holding room through an unguarded back stairwell. They walked him out dressed as a maintenance worker, and by the time the soldiers noticed the missing prisoner, it was already too late. The man in plain clothes had not been sent to stop her. He had been sent to make sure the escape went unnoticed. Everything else, the stolen files, the photograph, was a side effect of a mission only a handful of people knew about. And when the coup leaders discovered what had happened, they reacted with fury. They destroyed records. They hunted witnesses. They made the photograph disappear. But they never found her. Some said she fled across the sea. Others claimed she lived quietly in the countryside under a different name. The truth, even the men sitting in that cafe decades later didn't know. And maybe that was the point. Because sometimes survival depends on more than bravery. It depends on silence. The photograph was hidden once more, not out of fear, but out of respect. They both knew the moment it became public again, her trail would be hunted. And so the image returned to the shadows, waiting for the day the story could be told without risk. The day when truth would no longer be dangerous. Until then, all that remained was a grainy picture of a woman walking between walls of soldiers, and the knowledge that somewhere in the birth of a nation, she had rewritten history without ever firing a single shot.